Ladies and gentlemen, before I begin this presentation, let me ask you a simple question. I would have loved for you to raise your hands, but for the logistics reasons, probably a reflection, how many of you experienced a product delay, shortage, or an expected price increase in the last 3 years? While you pause and reflect on that, or ponder around it, the key issue which I want you to reflect on is that some of the reasons you're reflecting on, they were not random experiences that you have. They were symptoms of a system designed for a world that no longer exists. This takes me to the first part of my presentation, which I'll be dwelling more on the end of the supply chain as we knew it. We have moved from efficiency to control. Today, I want to make a but important argument in this presentation. And that argument is the global supply chain has not temporarily failed. It has structurally changed. What we're witnessing indeed is not a disruption to the old model. It is the end of that model. And what replaces it is a system governed by less of efficiency and more by risk, power, policy, and control. Ladies and gentlemen, for roughly 3 decades, global supply chains were built around a powerful and largely uncontested principle. And that principle was efficiency. Organizations optimize for the lowest possible cost through global sourcing, offshoring, and just-in-time inventory. Supplier bases were consolidated, buffers were stripped out, and risk was assumed to be manageable or irrelevant. And to be fair, this model worked for the greater part of our supply chains. It worked because trade was relatively stable, geopolitics were predictable, and logistics costs were low. Colleagues, what changed was not one event, but a sequence of structural breaks. Trade wars challenged the assumption of neutral role-based trade. COVID-19 exposed the fragility of lean, globally stretched systems. Geopolitical conflict and sanctions turned supply chains into instruments of state power. These were not temporary shocks. They permanently altered how risk, reliability, and control are distributed across the supply chains. And we see that according to the report of the WF Global Risks Report of 2026, they says 60% of firms globally experience production disruption due to supplier concentration since 2021. Now, what has changed? We are in a new norm, the new supply chain logic. What replaces the old model is not chaos, as I've alluded to. It is a new organizing logic. Supply chains are no longer optimized for the lowest cost. They are designed for acceptable cost under uncertainty. Global optimization gives way to regionalization and trusted networks, and markets alone no longer govern supply chains. Policies, regulations, and national interests are now embedded in them. And in short, I tell you, colleagues, supply chains have become governed systems. We have, indeed, aspects of geopolitics. We have industrial policies. We have regulations, tariffs. Supply chains today are not firm level systems. They are governed by these pillars that I've articulated. And therefore, competitive advantage is no longer about efficiency alone. It is about the ability to navigate governed systems. These are the new forces governing supply chains. The perspective is changing. This is why supply chain leadership has also moved from operations to the bottom. Because according to the PricewaterhouseCoopers survey, more than 70% of global CEOs, they rank supply chain risks among the top 5 strategic concerns. Supply chains have now moved from cost control, execution, efficiency, to value orchestration, risk governance, and strategic control. And therefore, we are seeing also a shift in terms of why procurement is now sitting at the center stage of the supply chain process. Logistics move goods, but procurement determines exposure. Who you source from, how concentrated your suppliers are, what your contract says, and how risk is allocated. These decisions now define resilience. And in the new supply chain order, inventory is no longer the primary buffer. Contracts, governance, and institutional capacity are. Let me take you now to looking at the perspective within the continent, because it is our interest as the African Institute for Supply Chain Research. And what I can say is that Africa did not cause the fragmentations of global supply chains, but Africa absorbs disproportionate risk due to its import dependence, logistics constraints, and limited supplier diversification. These issues we have alluded to in different platforms over the years. These vulnerabilities are amplified where procurement institutions are weak or under-resourced. Initiatives such as After Create Real Opportunity but opportunity without institutional readiness remains aspiration. Africa share over 3% of global trade. However, we still relied with over 80% of fertilizers that are being imported in many African economies, with over 70 to 90% of pharmaceuticals being imported. Border and compliance costs add up to probably 20 to 30% to trade costs in many African corridors. Therefore, we begin to ponder and ask a question, what the future holds for us. And in reality, in a rule-based, rule-heavy global system, institutional readiness, not cost, determines participation. And therefore, this brings me now to how we see 2026. I'm not going to dwell more on this because my colleague Evelyn is going to speak more into this. But what I want to highlight is the fact that in 2026, supply chains are no longer global plumbing. They are governed systems. We need to look at, in terms of the expectations, for example, within the energy reliability, that now that is top 3 location constraint for manufacturing. We look at issues of risks, tariff sanctions, and export control disrupt flows. Our institutional readiness, how ready and prepared that we prepare our institutions to be able to govern. These expectations are what we must be able to deal with. And as I conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to articulate strongly that supply chains can no longer be managed as cost optimization exercises. They must be governed. Procurement capability, institutional capacity, leadership judgment now determines resilience. The defining question is no longer whether global supply chains have changed. Colleagues, the question now sits is whether institutions and leaders are prepared to govern the new system. This takes me to our perspective as the African Institute for Supply Chain Research. What our contribution to the continent in terms of the advancement of a Pan-African supply chain harmonization and advancement in the system, we recommend governance and policy coherence, logistics and infrastructural reliability in the continent, skills and professional capacity, data and digital readiness, regional integration effectiveness. And as I conclude, I wish to thank you for making time to be with us again, and to state that resilience is no longer defensive. It is a source of competitive advantage, national capability, regional geopolitical relevance. The question is no longer how efficient is your supply chain in 2026, but rather how much control do you have when the system breaks. On that note, I want to thank you and to hand it over to our host. Thank you.